One of the most unpopular, if we could use that term, Torah readings is this week's, the Parsha of Bechukotai, which contains within it many dreadful curses against those who forsake the Torah. And even though it is a frightening narrative, it's hard to read those words, and that's why in the synagogue they're read at a more quiet tone, and it's not a portion of the Torah that people like to be called up to be there while it's read, but nevertheless it's part of Torah. And Torah is described by King Solomon as all of its past ways are peace. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. So even the curses have to be understood in a different light. And there are two ways of looking at it. Number one, we look at the curses and we realize that God says he's going to transform the curses into blessings. The greater the curse, the greater the transformation, the greater the blessing that follows. But even in its literal meaning, besides the fact that the blessings, the curses rather, are hidden blessings, one could read the blessings in two different ways. One could read, I'm going back, Freudian slip, calling it blessings, because that's exactly what it is. Deep down, the curses are different ways of expressing blessings, but blessings that cannot be articulated because they're so powerful. And here, one of the so-called curses slash blessings is you will flee and no one is pursuing you. Now, the simple meaning of that is, and this is a terrible curse, that a person will be suffering from anxiety, from fear, when there's nothing to be afraid of. This is a very, very painful experience. But there's a deeper way of explaining it, as has been explained by one of the Hasidic masters. But in order to understand that, first we have to introduce a concept that Judaism believes in and articulates, but it's very dangerous if it's taken to an extreme. And that is that God looks out for the one who is pursued. The victim is someone who we always have compassion for, and that's a positive thing. But there's a danger that we wallow in our victimhood, that we define our relationship with God by virtue of our suffering and pain, that we think that what defines us as Jews, considering the long history of the Jewish people being persecuted, is our suffering. And that's why we have to realize that being a victim is not the only way we can have a relationship with God, nor is it the ideal way of having a relationship with God. The ideal way is that even when we're not being pursued, even when we're not being threatened, even when we're not victims, we still have this positive relationship with God. They tell the story that before the 6-Day War, when Israel was a fledgling nation and threatened by its neighbors, they wanted to drive it into the sea, and a very famous Western academic supported Israel. And when Israel won miraculously, a tremendous victory, he complained. And he says, I only supported Israel because I thought they would lose. Somehow people will support the underdog regardless of who the underdog is and what the underdog is really guilty of. And victimhood becomes an end. Judaism says, no, it's not an end. And this is how they retranslate that verse. You will flee, but no one will be pursuing you. Flee, the Hebrew word for fleeing, nastem, could also mean you will be elevated. You'll be elevated even when no one is pursuing you, even when you're not a victim, even when you can't claim that you have a relationship with God based on your victimization. Even when things go smoothly, you also have, and ideally you should have, a good relationship with God that elevates you. And that's really what we're praying for in these last days of exile. We went through exile, we were victims consistently, and we developed a theology that explains victimhood and explains why there is suffering and tries to find meaning in suffering. That's all true. But we have to recognize we're entering into a new age, an age when there will be no more suffering, and we will have to readjust our theology to recognize that God could also have a good relationship with us, even when we prosper, even when we're happy, even when we're not being pursued. So even when you are not being pursued, you will be elevated.